Hi, everybody. Miss Franz here. We're going to be talking about government, comparing and contrasting different forms of citizen participation in governments. We will specifically learn about Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. And here you go. Here are our standards. So our essential question for this one would be, what are different forms of citizen participation in government? And then we talk about the roles, democratic governments, parliamentary and presidential. We talk about autocratic and democratic governments. And then we look at the specific countries for each one. So in the beginning, most of the countries in Africa were colonized, which we know until like 1950s, 1960s, 1990s, and even later. Okay. So there were a difference in autocratic and democratic government. An autocratic government is one where the absolute authority is invested in one leader. In an autocracy, people have few, if any, rights. They don't get to choose their leaders, vote on laws. If they disagree with their leaders, there's no authorized recourse in action. Autocracies include not only dictatorships and absolute monarchies, but also some democratic societies in which leaders deny basic rights, like freedom of press and speech, and they arrest opponents and suppress opposition. Okay, and then we know there's a democracy. Power lies within the people because they have the power to vote. In different democratic countries, there are different positions that people can fill by voting. In a parliamentary democracy, it's the members of parliament, a legislature, and an executive. In a presidential democracy, and in a direct democracy, they vote directly on laws. So here you go. We know parliamentary and presidential. We are a presidential democracy in the United States. And we know, like the big one, the main one we talk about, England, is a parliamentary democracy. And so we're going to continue on and look at the Republic of Kenya, which is a presidential, representative, democratic republic, which means there's a president. They vote for representatives, which is the democratic part. So in the 1960s, it became independent from Great Britain. We know the first leader was Jomo Kenyatta. There was lots of changes in the government, and they finally had a new constitution in 2010, a bicameral legislature, two. So that's very similar to what we have in the United States, which means we have a House of Representatives and we have a Senate. Okay. 2010, they abolished the prime minister, and they finally have some female representation, which they did not before. Okay, so here's the first president. Their new constitution also promises to reduce corruption. Okay. Kenya is currently a democratic republic. Here's where they're housed. The president is chief of state, or head of state, sorry, and chief executive. So there's the ones who do the head of state is kind of the ceremonial, the go to the dinners, present awards, and chief executive means they make the decisions, okay? Here's the fourth president, who's president right now. Directly elected by the people, 5-year term, and could be a second term. So they could do up to 10 years. They call it a parliament, even though there's no longer a prime minister, Senate and National Assembly. Citizens are responsible for voting, and here's inside of the parliament. So this is what it looks like in Kenya. And here's the information on a president. Must be 18 to vote, but it's not required by law. Like, it's not mandatory. Some countries it's mandatory. You have to go. You must vote when you're that age. It's not mandatory in the United States either. Here's some examples of voting in Kenya in 2013. So vastly different than how we do it, which ours is very electronic. Very more individualized, like people can't see who you're voting for, which they can't. If you can look over here, and I'm going around it, the polling booth. So when you're actually filling out your ballots, no one can see it. So here's the issue. We knew Kenya is a democracy. However, we also know they have some issues because they're mostly a one-party government, and corruption has been a major problem. So although they say there's a democracy and people get to vote and there's freedoms written into the Constitution, it has been completely dominated by the president and the Kenya National Party. Okay? Into the Republic of Nigeria, which is also a presidential representative democratic republic. Okay. Great Britain left in 1960. It was more peaceful. It had been one of the most stable governments in Africa. And then there was violence, because remember, it had like about 250 ethnic groups. They started fighting. There was military coups. There is a democratic government now from 1999. Here is our first elected prime minister. He was killed. Okay. There is a constitution to reduce corruption and protect the citizens. It also has a bicameral, 2 houses in their legislature. Here's their legislative building. And also their National Assembly. We call ours Congress. Kenya, Nigeria, National Assembly. Chief executive and head of state, also in Nigeria, so very similar to Kenya. Nigeria's president now. Once again, the people vote for the president, 5-year term, could have a second term if needed, so up to 10 years. The 2 houses, they also have Senate and House of Representatives. Here's Nigeria's parliament, and very noticeably, don't see any females, but okay. President works separately from the legislature, so they're not supposed to influence each other. However, the president is supposed to make sure that whatever laws are carried out, he makes sure they're followed. Citizens must be 18, but not required. Here's voting in Nigeria. Obviously, still, once again, very different. And Nigeria, again, is similar to Kenya, with corruption being a major issue. The elections have been afflicted with fraud. Citizens can't always rely on the courts to protect their freedoms. Women are not represented equally in the government. So here you need to know, all African nations are nominally democracies. They call themselves democracies, but many are in practice autocracies. Rather than thinking of nations as fitting into tidy boxes labeled democracy and autocracy, in Africa it becomes necessary to think of countries existing on a continuum between democracy and autocracy. And with those that protect human rights and civil liberties being the most democratic, and those who deny human rights and civil liberties being the most autocratic. So, was fair, free, well conducted. So it's been a while for Nigeria to have some more fair practices for their citizens. South Africa tends to hold free and fair elections and represent their outcomes. However, there's still the dominance of the African National Congress, and the lack of an effective opposition has led to corruption again. Independent in 1910, so early on, but we knew that there was the apartheid, so the racial segregation was a huge issue until 1994. Here's their Houses of Parliament. President is chief executive. He or she is the head of government and head of state. Okay, so technically, yes, it can be a female. It's not really what's happened. Okay, right now, this is who is in head of South Africa. Leaders are chosen by parliament. So similar, so it's a parliamentary democracy, although they have a president and they don't call him a prime minister. 1 5-year term, no more than 2. So it could be 10 years. So people vote for the members of parliament and the members of parliament vote for the president. So the people do not directly vote for their president. Here we go, the inside of the National Assembly chamber. So here again, just to make sure that you understand the difference. The major difference between a presidential democracy and a parliamentary democracy. Parliamentary democracy, the leader. Role of citizen, you must know this, on each and every country. Must be 18, but not mandatory. They can vote in elections for members of parliament. And then here's some comparisons to Nigeria and Kenya. South Africa is much stronger. It took them a while, but they're much stronger. Elections are more fair. The Constitution protects citizens. And people vote for representatives. And they can vote on issues and for those running for office. Personal freedoms are more numerous, which means since the separation of races, that since apartheid has ended, there is more equity in South Africa. However, wealth still doesn't reach a lot of the population, and they do have a low standard of living. All right. What you need to know. The people have ultimate political authority and choose their leaders in a democracy. The people have lots of political freedoms and civil liberties. In autocracies, they do not, because there is one person in charge. Most African countries say they are democracies, although most fall on the continuum closer to autocratic rule. So make sure for each country, not only do you know what type of leadership they have, what type of legislature they have, how their citizens are able to participate. You also need to know the type of government that they call themselves. So make sure you are aware of all of those things for all 3 countries, and that you can be able to compare and contrast them when asked. All right, see you later.